Welcome, everyone. My name is Elizabeth Beek. I coordinate adult education programs here at Trees Atlanta, and I'm really excited about today's virtual lunch and learn, Rethinking Invasive, Inclusive Language in Forest Restoration and Education. Thanks so much for being here. I also want to thank Quinn, my amazing colleague at Trees Atlanta, and all the presenters. So thank you for being a part of today. For those of you all who are new to Trees Atlanta, we're a nonprofit organization. Our mission is to protect and improve Atlanta's urban forests, and we do this through planting trees throughout the Atlanta metro area, through forest restoration projects and educational programs such as today's. And I invite you to find out how you can get more involved by coming to our website. There's so many great opportunities. I also want to thank our sponsors for today's Lunch and Learn, the City of Atlanta. And I really wish we were all in one room today and having an interactive discussion, but I also feel so thankful for tools such as Zoom that allow us to have amazing speakers from New York with us today and Rhode Island and people right here in Atlanta. So for this virtual presentation, if you have a question for the speaker, you can always drop it into the Q&A in your toolbar, and there'll be time at the end of today's discussion, and Quinn and I will be sharing your questions with the presenters. And then after today, a recording of today's presentation will be posted on our YouTube, which is youtube.com/treesatlanta. And we'll also be sending out a survey, and we would love your feedback. This helps our entire education team do a better job serving you. We have some really fun events coming up. We've got great tree tours. So if you're in for a staycation over the holidays, or if you have family or friends coming in, I encourage you to check out our new tree tour in Sylvan Hills and Capitol View neighborhood. And then also the day after Thanksgiving and the day after Christmas, there's a really fun East Side tour. So if you want an alternative to Black Friday, come out on the East Side Beltline Arboretum and with maybe lunch or something at Ponce City Market, and have a great day. If you're inspired by these tours and you feel like you have some cool trees in your neighborhood or in your neighborhood green space and you would be a good educator or tour leader, then I encourage you to apply for our training in 2026. It starts in January, and there's so many great neighborhoods, and the more you all give tours, the more people can connect. So check us out, sign up for our email newsletter, follow us on social media, and come to the website. There's tons of planting to be happening between now and March, and so many fun ways to connect with your community and get involved. And with this, these are the faces of the folks that I'm going to actually stop sharing my screen so you can meet them live and invite everybody on. And I'm going to ask you all just to kind of introduce yourselves and share how you got more involved in thinking about inclusive language in your work. So with that, I will mute myself and turn it over to Jonah.
Hi, everybody. My name is Jonah McDonald. I work for DeKalb County as the park naturalist at Mason Mill Park. And I've been doing this work for about 7 years, but I've been in the outdoors education and environmental education field for a long time. And when I first started working at Mason Mill Park, one of the big things I noticed was the wide variety of plants that had been introduced to the environment and all the monocultures that we had. And so I decided I was going to educate about that. And because I had been taught within the kind of standard invasion biology language, I accepted all of that. And one day I was out in the forest and I had this great teaching opportunity where I had a Chinese holly tree and an American holly tree growing very, very close to each other. So I stopped the group that I was with and I began describing the botanical differences between the two trees. And then I began talking about the negative effects of the Chinese holly tree. And I started using the language I had been taught, calling it an exotic tree, a noxious weed, and how we needed to eradicate it from the environment. It should not be here. And as I was using that language, all of a sudden I had an awareness in my mind that about half of the group that I was leading on this hike were people of Chinese origin. And I kind of stumbled over my words right there and realized that there might be something about the way I was speaking about this tree that came from a place where at least their ancestors had come from, that could be kind of triggering and othering in a way. And it got me thinking, I think there's something about how I'm communicating that is not in line with my values. Right about that same time, Danielle Bunch, who some of you may know, who works as the conservation manager at the Newman Wetlands Center. You probably saw the logo of Clayton County Water Authority on there. Danielle was not able to be with us today. She made a post on Facebook that said, I feel uncomfortable with the language that we're using to talk about invasive species. Is anybody doing anything different? And that, of course, struck me. And lo and behold, that kind of sparked lots of conversations that have been happening in lots of communities to kind of come together nationwide and create an organization called Just Language in Ecology Education. And that's how I got to meet Neha Savant in New York City. And so I get to introduce her to tell us about her work and how she got into this work. Neha?
Thanks, Jonah. Excited to be here. So, hi, everybody, my name is Neha Savant. I pronounce her she, her, and I am a wildlife and fisheries ecologist that works for the New York City Parks Department's Division of Environment and Planning. And that basically means that I conduct research and monitoring to protect and care for, advocate for, and maintain wildlife populations that are taking refuge in New York City parkland. And of course, vegetation management is a huge part of that task. And the way that I got into this, my family is from India, and I grew up with a lot of different Asian communities and different communities from different places. And upon entering the field of ecology and evolution and conservation biology, I recognized that there's a big difference between where I grew up and the community that I was entering into in this ecological restoration world. And as I went to school, I learned the standard terminology. I learned how much of an impact invasive species have on our environment. But I always felt like a little bit weird about how people were talking about it, particularly the words they were using, but also like the emotion and the kind of anger behind them. And it wasn't until I was able to join a group of Asian American women in conservation biology, where we were able to like talk about some of those feelings that we were having of discomfort and also frustration of like, how can we talk about this differently? And everybody was a little bit at odds of like, well, we don't really have things that we can really hold on to that are that different from in terms of language. And it just so happened that my future supervisor was also in that group. And she and a few colleagues at New York City Parks were really interested in figuring out ways that we could find different language, especially in an agency perspective. And so through a colleague, found Just Language and Ecology Education's website and their first webinar, and I watched it and devoured a lot of the content that was already created. And I then asked to join the steering committee. And that's how I got involved and met Jonah and met a lot of other great people that are trying to collaboratively do this work of finding new and implementing new language. And I think that I'm actually not sure who's next, either Iris or Carrie.
Thanks, Nihat. I'll go. My name's Carrie Keogh. I'm a faculty member in the Environmental Sciences Department at Emory University. And my background is in marine ecology and really sort of evolutionary ecology of host-parasite interactions. And I had a whole number of years during graduate school and just afterwards getting to focus really hard on sort of using non-native species as an opportunity to learn things about coevolutionary relationships between species. And, so I was really like neck deep in the scientific literature, if you will, at that time. And, of course, the scientific literature, attempts to be really precise and it assumes itself to be neutral. And, I'd never really questioned the way that the language that we use in the science of evolutionary ecology and the study of invasive species might translate externally in the way that that could be harmful. And I had this aha moment back in, it must have been like 2017, maybe. I was applying for jobs after finishing my PhD, and I was interviewing at a liberal arts college and had an interview with the dean. And the dean asked me a question about my work. And she asked me about the language around invasive species and the way that outside of the realm of evolutionary ecology, that language could be interpreted. And my jaw was on the floor. Like I had never really stopped to consider, like, holy crow, I don't know, never really think about the way that this works outside of, this group of people who have sort of agreed on a set of terms. And so, you know, beyond that point, this was sort of nagging in the back of my mind. And then just about a couple of years ago, I had a group of students at Emory working with a local stakeholder, Allison Erickson, who is the urban naturalist for City of Decatur. And she connected one of the students in the group who had an interest in environmental education. I think he's on the call, Will Hutchinson. With Danielle to say, hey, there's this, Will was working specifically on developing some outreach plans for a local elementary school and interested in how to talk about invasive plants and forest restoration in a way that would be friendly and accessible to this group of students. And so I was really led into the Just Language project through the efforts of students like Will and Iris, who sort of were willing to question and problematize the language that we use in the science classroom, especially as they're engaging and helping me engage in sort of more thoughtful education and outreach approaches around some of those topics. So it hasn't made me leave behind the core language, particularly in the sciences. I think that it's maybe in a lot of ways made me focus more on using language that emphasizes these critical co-evolved relationships that underlie the health of a lot of our local ecosystems. And then it also helps me understand, instances where there are so many external forces challenging those ecosystems that, modifying the way that we think about and look at things like novel species or translocated species, can sort of shift the way that we think about interacting with those communities, those ecological communities. Iris, on to you.
Yeah, so I'm Iris. I'm currently a PhD student in anthropology at Brown University in Rhode Island, but I did my undergraduate at Emory and took a ecology of invasions class with Dr. Keogh. But I really got interested in forest restoration when I was a Trees Atlanta intern during COVID, or during like the latter half of COVID, and I found a lot of purpose in doing forest restoration and meeting a lot of the different people in Atlanta that were like outside of my undergraduate bubble, and also at a time when you couldn't make many connections. Generally, it was nice to sort of have these outdoor spaces to do so. But I also became really interested in sort of the plants that we were working with, which were often in Atlanta coded with the same nation of origin that my parents immigrated from, and I am Chinese American, so I identify with. And during COVID, I became, at a time when it was really difficult for my family, or impossible for my family to visit our extended family in China, I also became really interested in how, and almost connected to the plants, in that I imagine that where my family grew up, that these plants also thrived and also were potentially weedy. And I found that sort of interest stymied by the fact that a lot of the language that we're presented with in forest restoration kind of cuts off those potential connections. And in sort of the conversations that Dr. Keogh and we raised in sort of these invasion ecology classes, and continuing my work into my master's thesis and now my PhD, which is really critically interested and still works in Atlanta, Georgia, on sort of relationships with non-native species, both in the ways that we make forests into spaces of meaning through doing stewardship, so doing careful removal, but also the ways that people perhaps relate to plants outside of that. And the sort of central question that I started with that was about language, and that drew, I think I just like sent an email or something to the Just Language Collective, and they have been really helpful in sort of formulating those questions and finding space for that work. So yeah, I'm really grateful to be here.
So you all can see why I'm excited and honored to be on this panel with these folks. And I hope that by hearing our stories, you all will kind of understand where we're coming from. But I think I'm going to get back to this concept that I mentioned, I think others of us did in our introductions as well, of values. Because oftentimes when we're talking about science communication or science, we don't oftentimes bring in our values. And sometimes we're able to really separate those apart, uh, particularly if we're a fish in the water of that language. It's just easy to not notice. And so for me, it took being in an environment in that with that American holly tree and the Chinese holly tree and that group of people who many of them were from China to realize that my language was not connected with my values. And so I started really trying to root myself in like, so when you try to figure out, boy, this is all I know, but it doesn't seem to match my values, and my personal values are things like nonviolence. My values are inclusivity, accuracy in my, accuracy in speech, connection, um, uh, and so many times the language, at least in this aspect of environmental communication, just didn't feel like it was in line with those. And so I think what we're going to share with you all today is rooted in values. And I invite each of you who are listening to this panel to think about like what your values are. And it doesn't just go to this topic of invasive species, which is what we're talking about today, but you may find that there's other aspects of your working life where the language that you've been taught doesn't fully jive with your values. And you may find that it does too. So, but I think that's our personal thing. And I think one of the things we really want to make sure we get across is that even though we're going to present a language guide that provides some guidance on how language can be used differently, particularly in describing species that are moved across borders, um, there's not one right way. And so use the guide as a guide. And you may find that with a group of kids, you use different language than with a group of, doctoral scientists. You may find that with people who are just being introduced to even the idea of botany at all, you use one type of language. But with folks that are old hats at this, you may use different. So definitely interpret it for where you're at. And so the way we would like to start is by talking about some of the challenges that we've each found with the current language around invasive species. And the one that I'll lift up is kind of violent and militaristic language. And this kind of gets to emotion as well, which Neha mentioned in the introduction. But what I find and what we see historically is the field of invasion biology. Even the word invasion biology is a very angry, militaristic, almost violent term. And the field itself was developed right after World War II. And if you know the history of that time period, you know that that was the vibe, right? They were just ending a war. There was a lot of xenophobia, and there was also a lot of focus um, on fighting and war as part of it. So when we talk about invasion biology, obviously plants and organisms are not invading our land. That is they have been moved by humans in many cases, but that terminology persists. And then oftentimes when I am leading a restoration or stewardship program, I oftentimes see people kind of coming in with like a real, I don't know, it almost feels macho to me. And I've been guilty of this myself, where I come in and I'm like, I'm gonna rip these out of the ground. I'm gonna use my muscles and I'm gonna just drag that privet out. And it just feels like, I don't know, it just feels a little angry. And also uh, it doesn't match with the person I want to be in the world. And so I struggle with that. And that's a challenge I have with a lot of the typical language that's used. But it's not the only one. I think, Iris, you're going to continue with another challenge.
Yeah, and I think the one that I'm going to talk about, we've already alluded to in different ways, and Jonah particularly through his story, but the ways in which xenophobia can sort of shine out in our language in often unintentionally, but in ways that can result in sort of conversations that make restoration spaces uncomfortable. And so through my master's thesis, I did a lot of participant observation, so attending different restoration events and sort of talking with people. And we also presented this at the Park Pride conference last spring. And through those, I have two sort of stories that I would like to share. And the first was during one of these large forest restoration events, where there's a lot of information to get through and a lot of different people that you're trying to control the attention of. And also the introduction of many different plants that people aren't familiar with. But what I found was that in that process, when I was talking to people afterwards who were trying to identify species and trying to do the stewardship work, because they had been introduced to Chinese privet as Chinese privet, they both didn't really have the tools to identify it. They didn't know what the leaf shape looked like or other sorts of characteristics. And they also kind of forgot the privet and focused much more on it being Chinese. So referring to it as, is this the Chinese thing that we're supposed to pull? And then another moment in which, so as I said, I am Chinese American, but at the Park Pride conference, we also had a very emotional story told to us afterwards from this woman who came to the US to study landscape architecture, who is also Chinese. And she relayed these sorts of moments where people would make jokes at her expense, to asking her why she had brought those plants over here. And of course, those jokes are sort of made in this uncomfortable medium space. But a lot of people that I talked to, including practitioners who were interested in sort of the work that I was doing, were kind of a lot of these uncomfortable jokes that were made and had to be mitigated somehow. And it's not to say that that these sorts of nation of origin or location-based species names aren't always helpful in sort of being able to easily communicate where that something is not from here, but that it also has these sorts of unintended consequences, particularly with Chinese folks or when other people of color are in these spaces as well.
I'll talk about a challenge from my perspective, more from even the perspective of, coming at this as a scientist, reading scientific literature. I will, now that I'm sort of sensitized to thinking about, wow, some of these terms, since Jonah and others have pointed out the history, in the development of some of the language that's used to talk about these things, that there's a lot of there's sort of an imposition of values from the get-go, and subjectivity in a realm that we usually inherently try to assume is objective. And so while I think scientific language, scientists talking to other scientists they try to be precise. There are papers like in the literature they're saying, here's all the definitions that we're using in the literature, right, to sort of make it clear the technical terms that people are using. But even with these attempts at objectivity, I'll still now read a paper and say, whoa, there's no way that this scientist is approaching this problem with sort of an open mind about what the consequences of the presence of this novel species might be, right? You can sort of read the introduction and say, the language that's being used sort of undermines this sort of theoretically neutral, framing that people are hopefully bringing into science when they're asking questions to really be able to understand what the changes are that are resulting from species movements. And I don't want to try to suggest that that there should be an assumption of neutrality necessarily, and that there wouldn't be an ecological cost or an ecological consequence, if you will, of species movements, just because, we recognize that the co-evolved relationships in ecological communities are really what makes them tick, and the diversity of species there is what helps them have these fantastic ecological functions that we all value. But, a lot of times recognizing the huge amounts of modification that, especially urban ecosystems have undergone, you know, a lot of us who are trying to understand what's going on in those systems really need to be able to come at this and say, well, there's a possibility that the species that have been moved here are doing things that we really need them to do, you know, and I hate for there to be, you know, the possibility that we sort of miss out on those contributions by being sort of forced into this sort of narrow-minded framework by the language that we're using, even in the sciences. And I guess just from a, you know, the social standpoint, my job now is really more teaching focused. And so I worry that if I'm presenting only sort of this unquestioned language that we use in the sciences to students, undergraduate students, right, who are maybe interacting with this for the first time, and maybe they haven't had a class on evolutionary biology or ecology yet, that they could get just instantly turned off, right, by this sort of language that imposes sort of these kind of xenophobic sounding or judgments on plants and animals that they've only just met. And so the opportunities to focus on things like, you know, here are some locally evolved species, here's a species that's not locally evolved, and we're still trying to understand what its impacts are, you know, gives them more opportunity, I think, to understand what the underlying ecological questions are, and also how they can plug in in a more hopefully inclusive way to this, you know, potential pathway into ecology.
Yeah. And I'll add from a New York City perspective, I think that uh, a lot of the things that have been said also are at play in our work, but I'll speak from the practitioner perspective of people that are actively trying to change the ecosystem around to make room for more um, diverse assemblages. So my focus is generally amphibians, which, like many people are like, there are amphibians in New York City. Yes, there are amphibians in New York City. They have persisted. And one of my favorite populations is a population of dusky salamanders in New York City, in Manhattan. And there is a park that has a great crew of caretakers, of stewards that work to maintain that population and the habitats around. And this story I like to tell around the impact of the emotionally charged language is about how it can really narrow the ways that even practitioners think about what the role of caretaking or stewarding really is. And so, in this particular story, there was one person who was taking down Norway maple trees because these trees tend to be the dominant cover if they're present, and they don't allow for other tree species that are a little bit more longer lived to develop in the canopy. And one day I was coming to visit the dusky salamander seep, and I saw that Norway maples had just been like laid down in the seep itself. And it's a very sensitive area. It's a very limited area. And I was like flabbergasted. But instead of getting mad and calling out the person for it, we had a meeting and we talked a little bit more about the general goal of environmental stewardship, which is not just to make a more native landscape or more locally evolved landscape of plants, but also to maintain that relationship between the salamander, the plants, the seep, the rocks, the whole picture. And because that crew was very focused on plants and didn't understand the ecological needs of, or even the relationship between the salamander and the trees in that area, it really affected, you know, for the next like 30 to 40 years, um, that habitat, which will now have less cover and will affect the temperature of that salamander seeped area. And so I mentioned this because I think with an increasing amount of ecological knowledge, which I think everybody here is gaining, our awareness of the changes that our landscapes have gone through and continue to move through can bring up really strong emotions, and it can be really overwhelming. And unfortunately, science and our natural resources spaces don't always allow us to feel those, to talk about those in ways that allow us to make sense of the different ecosystems and the different ecological communities that are mixed together, especially in urban settings, but also the cultural communities that exist together. But I think when we allow space for those emotions, like anger, frustration, sadness, or confusion, it can help us feel more connected to not only the plants and the animals that we're caretaking, but also each other, and still maintain our differences within that. So trying out new language over the past few years has brought the practitioners together more, and not only to relate to one another more, but also to think bigger than just maintaining a certain plant community and involve wildlife in that equation as well.
Yeah, and I think that's a great sort of move into our next field or topic, which is thinking about the applications of the language guide that Jonah had talked about earlier, which really, as he said, tries not to be prescriptive, but thinks about different uses. And so Jonah, Dr. Keogh, and Neha are all going to present sort of their experiences trying to apply this to their different contexts.
And that's me first, right? Yes. So when I first started noticing when I started noticing the disconnect between my values and my language, the first thing I moved to was calling, because I work a lot with children. The first thing that I moved to was calling invasive plants pushy plants. And I would call the plants bullies. I would describe, because I figured kids know what a pushy person is and or a bully is. And I even produce signage that's at my park right now that I have not replaced that still says pushy plants. And people get what that is, but I feel like it's almost a little misleading because the plants are just doing what they do best. They're not literally being pushy. They're not bullies. They're introduced and they are overabundant. And so I've been trying to figure out other ways to describe this, particularly with children. And one of the big fears when I've posted about this on social media, people have pushed back and said, if you are not black and white about this, if you're not like make it as simplified as possible, pushy, that's simple, right? If you're not simple, you're going to lose people. And I'm like, well, okay, so I'm open to that concept, right? So who am I going to lose? I'm going to lose children, right? So if I show gray area and complexity, we're going to lose the children. So I have to be really blunt and direct with children and simplify it. But recently, Iris and I led a program that was with a group of children doing restoration work. And I decided to try on a new way of doing this and not calling it pushy plants, but instead I started talking about how diversity in an ecosystem shows that the ecosystem is most sound and most healthy. And so if we look around and we see too much of one species, and I described what monoculture was to the kids, and I think they got that. If we see that there is too much of one particular species, there's not enough diversity. But I also tried to describe to them that just because privet is overabundant doesn't necessarily make it bad. And I told them that I want to approach nature with love. And so even though we are about to pull plants out of the ground, which will kill these plants, I'm also trying to find other ways to show my love and care for these plants, even if I also know it's my job as a steward of the environment to remove some of them. So I told the kids about how I started a bonsai project in which I was taking plants that we usually consider invasive and then lovingly constructing them into bonsais, and how that was a way for me to show love for these plants, but also not to let them become overabundant in the environment. And the kids were interested in that topic. And then we started our project. And we were pulling privet out of the grounds, and the kids were doing a great job with it. They learned how to identify the plant. And then they came to Iris and I and said, we want to take privets home and turn them into bonsais too. And the kids started collecting these little privet seedlings and saying, we want to love these privets too. But they had also taken them out of the ground. And I was like, oh my God, what are the parents going to think when these kids are bringing privet seedlings home? But where I came to with this was those kids truly got the complexity. Even though I was not saying this bad, this good, bad, good, black and white, the kids saw the gray area between, and the kids saw that they could both be pulling these out of the ground as a way to restore the environment, but they could also find a way to love this thing that they were also destroying. And to me, I really think that is the approach that I want to take, is allowing people um, uh, trusting people to get complexity.
I can build off of that to talk about the way that this kind of a similar thing, making room for complexity has played out, in taking undergraduate students out into Emory Forest to conduct what I used to call invasive plant management activities, and now I call stewardship opportunities, because it feels more like the kind of thing that I want us to be trying to engage, trying to partake in. I recognize that there are some challenges to that terminology as well, but from from even just setting the mindset, or helping set the mindset of the students about how we're about to use our time and what kinds of things we're trying to learn from it, it feels like starting from a framework of stewardship is asking them or inviting them to pay more attention to not just what are some of the species that might be, like Jonah said, overabundant, not locally evolved, and maybe making it hard for some of the local species to have, adequate sunlight access or water resources or whatever it is. That, being able to, ask them about stewardship helps them think about, well, what are all the species that are here? Not just like this one focal species that we're going out to reduce the population size of, for example. So I think it leaves a lot more room for developing curiosity, and also for thinking about these spaces, these impacted forests, and particularly stream riparian areas, a lot more holistically. So I might have students, recognizing that one of our goals is to, cut some privet, but we might say, okay, would it make sense to cut this all the way down to the stream bank? Why or why not? And, helping students sort of ask questions about ecological functions, like, the critical role that privet are playing in a lot of our campus streams, or some of our campus streams anyway, and perhaps holding soil in places where the flows are just too flashy for some of the native plants to really be able to hang on. And so, yeah, my hope is that transition in language really like invites a closer look by the students, instead of just simplifying and saying, we're going to take out this species because it's not from here. It really hopefully makes it possible to say, from an ecological perspective and from a community ecology perspective, how do our impacts of human activities in these landscapes result in this need for stewardship on our part, and what can that look like in a way that is geared toward preserving ecosystem functions and diversity. So I'll pass it on to Neha, I think. Oh, and I guess I just want to also say that, in addition to thinking that this probably makes the students have a happier experience while they're doing these activities, because they're not feeling that sort of rage like Jonah described, or they're not, like Neha said, they're not trying to, I guess, not have any kind of emotional engagement with the work. They're sort of invited to like sort of think about it in a caretaking way, which I think lets them be, just happier in the work. I've noticed that for myself, that I'm a lot happier in the garden or doing restoration activities if I can, now that I'm like thinking in this sort of alternate framework.
Yeah, one big application that we've had at New York City Parks with this language change is to try and operationalize it as like an agency-wide shift. And I think New York City, we were able to do that because of just every city has incredibly diverse communities, but I think New York City in particular has such a history of immigration and so many different diverse communities that we work to involve in stewardship. And so when thinking about applying these language changes to multiple, I guess, user groups, we had to be really careful in thinking about the audience. And so Jonah mentioned kids, Carrie, you mentioned students, and our main I guess, audiences have been practitioners like myself and many people on this call, volunteers, and also contractors. And so for practitioners, a favorite replacement word for non-native is introduced. A lot of people don't like it because it isn't always accurate because some of these species have been here for a long time. But we also use the word problematic to describe the kind of subjective nature of categorizing species in these different ways and us wanting to remove or adjust one versus another. The special thing about New York City is that we also have many locally evolved or native species that we manage and remove as well. White-tailed deer are a big challenge, and in many places in the Northeast and just the East in general, we try and decrease the amount of deer, but that is a locally evolved species that has undergone lots of different changes in the habitat. Smilax is another wetland species that we will remove in large contracts, and that's also a locally evolved species. And so the kinds of realities of ecological restoration already kind of usurp the binary between native and non-native, and really help us understand the bigger picture of trying to build ecosystems that can maintain ecological communities that are diverse. Um, and when we manage bigger restoration contracts, similar to some of the ways that people are saying we need to like have a very quick way of figuring out how to communicate a complex thing in succinctly, because contractors have to think about hydrology, geology, erosion, and all these other pieces. We simplify the language for them too, and we'll often use the word desired or undesired to make it simpler for contractors that are balancing complex restoration projects. We would not say this to volunteers. Um, because volunteers are looking to get connected to and build a relationship with their natural environment. Contractors are doing something very different. And so, in the same way that we're thinking about using different language in different contexts, I think it's really important to think about what the goal is when you're using your language. For contractors, it's for simple communication to complete the contract, but for volunteers and for the public, it's really to build a relationship with their local ecosystem and to find a way to continue stewardship over time. And so, from a New York City Parks perspective, it's been a kind of a fun challenge to figure out the ways to apply this generally. But we do have a list of about 5 different recommendations across the agency for any public communications, and one of them is to avoid using the word invasive because it can create misunderstandings. And even though practitioners here really do and have learned, for decades that invasive is the word to use because of some of the concerns around xenophobia and emotionally charged nature of this work, many practitioners within our agency have reduced the use of invasive and non-native and tried to expand their vocabulary a bit more.
I think Iris and I both unmuted at the same time. You're probably about to say the same thing I was about to say. You go ahead.
Yeah, so I was just, so as sort of Neha was, or as we've all been talking about, that there are many sort of different applications for different language. And we also wanted to underscore that the sort of experience of changing your language, especially when it's something that you've grown up learning and it's the frameworks that you've learned, is not really a one-way process and is not always easy. I think in the events that Jonah and I led, the Nature Walk and Works, where we tried to sort of balance half nature walk and then half restoration event, although it ended up being much more of a walk. But I think Jonah could probably say that the language I used changed immensely. And even in my first iterations of it, I felt myself sort of relying on what I was always used to using. So invasive, calling things Chinese privet. And by the end of the sort of sessions that we led, I think I really came into feeling with, or came to understand what felt more comfortable for me. And that often meant sort of not using or trying to find alternative names that relied on plant characteristics instead of nation of origin, doing things like calling something overabundant and introduced per se. And I think that as Dr. Keogh mentioned also made me a lot more comfortable in sort of the education that I was doing. But I think that it's a process that continues, and even in my sort of academic work, I still refer to things as invasive species because that sort of pinpoints what I'm trying to get at. So that's all to say that these sorts of experiences are always a work in progress. And we also invite people to not always try to be always right, but to be constantly sort of working and progressing and talking with others.
We had a few other things that we were considering sharing, but we think maybe the best way to get the conversation going is to see if there's questions, and then uh, we can make it into more of a conversation instead of you just hearing our stories.
Thank you, guys. So if you have not already and you have some language that maybe that you've been experimenting with or questions that you have for the presenters, then we want to invite you to drop those into the Q&A so we can share those. And right now I do see Tasha, who you may know, Jonah, said that when she came in and she was listening, she really felt a connection. And that she shared that she really appreciated that we're taking time to shift how we speak, and not just correcting words, but examining the spirit behind it. And she shared that as a Black woman, she carries her differences outward every day, and her skin tells a story before she even opens her mouth. So when she was introduced to this construct by you, Jonah, this conscious effort to evolve our language, it felt so deeply personal, and it reminded that the way we talk to and about each other can either reinforce barriers or build bridges. And we're living in a time where respect and acceptance should be our daily practices. And when our language grows, it shows our culture is growing too, and making space for everyone's story to be seen and valued. And I just wanted to share that she had dropped that in the comment, and I thought it was beautiful. So thank you, Tasha.
I have one question that particularly popped up was, how do we deal with pushback? Um, I think David said once he posted on Instagram about not using language of hate around Bradford pear or Callery pear, because there's a lot of people that say they hate those trees. And like a lot of the comments are really hostile. And he said lots of people are deeply bought in to their quest to eradicate invasives. So I'm curious for my co-panelists, how do you deal with that kind of like angry pushback?
I guess I'll jump in. Social media is a really hard place. It is not a place for nuanced discussion or, generative, collaborative um, discussion about something as complicated as invasion in in general. And so, I guess I'll preface with that. I've also found it really difficult to engage with people that are really holding on tight to this understanding that invasive species are all bad and need to be eradicated. I think I've found more benefit in the kind of curiosity realm. I have kind of put a boundary for myself of not engaging with people right now that like are in that like holding on really tight because it often backfires and then it really just becomes unpleasant for everybody involved. And so I tend to put my time towards creating spaces where you can discuss some of the tricky challenges around not only like ecological restoration, but the language. Both are very equally complex. But like Jonah mentioned, I think it helps to understand that like I think everybody has the capacity to understand the complexity, but it's really like the spaces that you're able to do that in. And so when it comes to like on social media, if I do engage, it's often like it's really complicated. But I'll often not try to negate what they're saying in that moment.
Thanks. Did anybody else want to respond to that? Thanks, Neha. We had another question that is from Marley. To what degree is it useful to include some discussion of the history of colonialism and imperialism in education and interpretation regarding the narratives we use for introduced and non-native species? A
I think
beautiful question. Yeah, go ahead. Iris, this
this
is
is a
totally your
good one
wheelhouse. Yeah,
for
yeah.
me to answer. And I think is a really good point. And I think again, it's sort of this thing where there are different spaces where these perhaps that education is more helpful than others. One of the walks that Jonah and I led was doing both the history of Mason Mill and sort of the both the ecological history and the human history of Mason Mill. So interweaving sort of changes that we see in the landscape with the very violent history in Mason Mill of enslavement and I mean, you told me that story about how it was the Decatur waterworks and they shut down the waterworks during World War II. And part of that was because of fear of sort of Japanese invasion in this Decatur Waterworks in Atlanta, Georgia, or in Decatur. But I also think that, so a lot of my current work is trying to think about the histories of the landscapes that we steward. And I found that in every place that I was in Atlanta, that there was sort of this, there was once a plantation there, or there was always sort of the removal, eradication of the Muskogee people from that space. There was histories of enslavement. There were histories of sort of brick making and convict leasing labor. These really dark histories that also aren't eradicated by the plants regrowing over them, that you still sort of see the remnants of them. And part of my interest has also been in sort of connecting people with that history. And I found that I think, and I think it's still sort of a working progress or a working process of how to sort of integrate that, especially in spaces where people aren't expecting to hear about history. I think sometimes that can be a difficult thing to bring up. But for instance, like at Mason Mill Park, where the name of the park sort of directly derives from the Ezekiel Mason, the owner of the mill there and the slave owner, or somewhere like Connolly Nature Park, where also the name directly derives from the plantation family who owned the land prior, it is also hard to sort of disentangle the history. So I think that's a good question and sort of something I'm interested in continuing to think about.
We had a question from Adam about where can we find the most up-to-date resources regarding this topic, and excuse me, and what communities and groups are leading the conversation and exploration, how can we connect with them. The number one thing would be the website justlanguage.org, which is a national working group of folks like, honestly, it's kind of like rooted in New York, the Pacific Northwest, and Atlanta, but there's people from other places as well. And so check that out. But this might be a space also to drop in the chat our the language guide that the Just Language community has put together. And so I'm going to put well, I just had it and I was about to put it in the chat. Now I've got to copy it again. Here we go. And so you can get there from this link that I just put in the chat. Obviously, those of us in Atlanta, and Adam, I know that you're an Atlantan as well. Please always use me or Danielle as a resource, because we're particularly, we're your colleagues and passionate about this. Beek, is there, I know we're getting close to our 1 o'clock. Where else should we go with this? Okay, there was another question from Allison. Do you still use the common names to ID plants that will be removed if you are leading a workday for older kids or adults? I'll speak to this, but I'm interested to hear what Neha does in New York and what Iris has done in other environments too. I have been working on using common names. Iris already mentioned this, common names that are descriptive instead of nation of origin based. And so, uh, first of all, a descriptive common name is so much easier to remember. So, for example, instead of that Chinese holly that we started the webinar with, I now call it horned holly. And if you know the species, which most people know as Chinese holly, if you look at the way the leaf grows, the little points look like little horns. And so it's super easy to remember if you use the common name horned holly, as opposed to ilex. Oh, it's not in my mind right now. So that's, for example, that's what I'm trying to do with common names. Others?
Yeah, I think one of our guidelines for our agency communication, like biodiversity communication guidelines, is to remove a place of origin or offensive terms from our common names. And when we reviewed the common names, especially for species that we manage in stewardship, like volunteer capacities, like we already were using names that were pretty that followed those rules. So luckily, we didn't have too much of a challenge to remove the place names. But we also find that it's not always yeah, it's not always necessary to include. I think Japanese knotweed is one that's really common in practitioner circles, and if we use the word knotweed, e- everybody knows, the specific species that we're working with in that context, and so it's been helpful to simply remove it, and then if you need to specify, you can use a scientific name or other characteristics like Jonah mentioned.
Yeah, and I think we have one more question in the chat in the Q&A from Adam about the panel's thoughts on using indigenous plants versus colonizing/colonizer plants. One connection with colonization is the homogenation that comes with both the colonizing people and culture and the spread of the non-native plants.
Um, I can add. I think one of the struggles with language is that we include like this binary that like again like indigenous is good and colonizer is bad. It's much more complicated than the binaries, and I think that one of the challenges that we've had to is um, trying to understand how to create enabling conditions for um, humans and non-humans to exist without homogenization. And I think that that is the goal for culture and for ecological communities. Um, but it is a challenge, I think, because I think colonizer plants it also demonizes plants in a way that doesn't recognize like the fullness of what people are coming from and what plants and animals are coming from. Um, that's my best my best answer with that one. And if oh, go ahead, Iris or Carrie.
I was going to jump in and say there's maybe a connection to, I saw another question in the chat that was asking about connection to sort of indigenous perspectives and indigenous maybe language around, or I guess relationships around language, or excuse me, language around these relationships. And I'm not an indigenous science scholar at all, but I will say that we've read like there's scientific literature that's sort of probing that question about are there different perspectives that might be brought from an indigenous viewpoint on the way that we think about non-native species or translocated species. And it's a great fruitful additional angle from which to explore this that we haven't really had a chance to sort of think about or touch on here. But yeah, that has to do with recognizing the association with colonialism and history of colonialism, but also recognizing that indigenous cultures may look at plants and animals in more of a family orientation, like as part of families with their own agency, and that doesn't necessarily get there's not room for that when we're thinking about management and stewardship and sort of imposing our own values and perspectives from a conservation science perspective on the makeup of these ecological communities. So I think it's complicated and worth exploring, and I don't think that we have the answers here.
Well, it is getting pretty close, and thank you all so much for sharing today, and thank you everybody for sharing your ideas and thoughts in the chat and questions. And before we go, are there any, were you able to drop the guide into the chat, or is that something we should follow up with in our follow-up email?
Yeah, let me just wrap up by telling you all, I assume that most of the people logging in are from Atlanta, but you may not all be. But I want to invite you all to read through the language guide that we put in the chat, which of course is a starting point. And you can see how we're all working with this from our own perspectives. But I also want to thank you, particularly those of you in Atlanta, for listening to this, because I feel like here in Atlanta, we have such a tight-knit ecological community that we, I believe, have a great opportunity to join together and really thinking about this and really expanding the tent of folks who are doing environmental learning, environmental teaching, and environmental stewardship. And so it's really good to see all your names in this chat. And I guess my challenge is to experiment with it. Next time you're communicating with somebody, experiment with a new way. I don't think you're going to go wrong. And then tell us, tell us how it went. Did it feel weird? Or did you get pushback on social media? Or did it feel right? Did it feel like it was in line with your values? And I hope we can continue this conversation in other venues. And I know something that's on my radar is wanting to bring together a group of people in person in Atlanta to support each other on this. So thanks for everybody for being here. And of course, thanks to Carrie, Neha, Iris, and of course, Trees Atlanta. Really appreciate y'all.
Thank you, everybody, and we'll be sending